So I just want to pick up something that you mentioned. You have a view that people could potentially view waste as a potential resource instead of a problem.
Waste often has been, even at best times, a byproduct of what we do. But then what do you then do with it? How we can make the most of it?
Hey, welcome to Manufacturers Make Strides. I'm your host, Martin Griffiths, and today I'm going to be diving into something that impacts every manufacturer, and that's waste. But not exactly in the way that you think, because today I'm joined by Greg Logelain, who's Associate Director at Ricardo, and he spent his career proving that waste isn't just a problem to deal with, it's an opportunity just waiting to be unlocked. So from turning waste into resources through to helping businesses rethink how they use materials, Greg's here to show how manufacturers can create real value where others see just challenges. So we'll hear some incredible stories, bust a few myths about waste management, and most importantly, talk to you about steps that you could take to make a difference in your operation starting today. So let's get straight into it now. So hey Greg, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
Excellent. Yeah, really good, thanks. Really good. Okay, so I wanted to start off, this may be an oversimplification, but from my point of view, Greg, you're all about waste. But it's not maybe something that people think about in detail every day. I definitely, as much a viewer, because I can imagine. Why does it matter so much to you?
I think, and I frankly can understand, I'll be honest, there's a lot of things going on in everyone's lives, and especially in terms of the world of business. And I've been fortunate in that I've had lots of opportunities to work in the sector, which has shown really just the sheer variety, but also just the opportunities within it as well, in terms of making use of waste. And the big shift is trying to change the naming around it. It's a resource at the same time, ultimately, and how to sort of really get the most out of it. So to me, that's where the interest comes from, because there's this value to be had from it.
So it's a challenge itself, but also the challenge of changing people's perceptions of it as well. Yeah. So what do you think happens if waste or the management, the sensible management of waste gets ignored? What impact do you think that has on business or, on the planet?
It's generally just to the detriment of all parties. There's sort of arguments to be really made about, of course, there's the ultimate sort of long-term impacts and where material ends up and how it's best used. But even on a sort of more present and commercial sense, is the fact that there's inefficiencies that are increased because of the lack of use of these materials. And I think, understandably, we've gone through such rapid development in the 21st century in terms of opportunities, how everything's grown around that, and industry's really sort of catching up with this. And the terminology I probably use is that we're victims of our own success, I think, for the most part. And that's where waste is sort of evident to that. And it's sort of really just the sort of legacy to how well we're doing. The change now is coming that we're seeing, of course, the impacts becoming so great in a lot of areas that change is occurring. And naturally so, because, of course, as we're seeing, the value of these materials can increase to become future use. And it gives more greater argument for newer innovative solutions in waste to make the most of it at the same time.
Okay. Well, it sounds really interesting. I think we're going to dig more into some of those aspects a little bit later on. It sounds like you've got some kind of really interesting perspectives on this. But just before we do that, I wanted to just ask you a little bit to what path led you to where you are today in waste management? How did you get there? How did you stumble across this career?
That's a good question. And there's a phrase that we go to, and us and waste, we refer to ourselves in a very sort of sort of simple terms of we consider ourselves wasters in this industry. And a lot of us, and there's a go-to phrase as well that we use, is that very few of us ever aim to go and get into waste. Very few of us have started out on that route. But once you get into it, it's one of these things that sort of hooks you, because of just, it really opens up all these different pathways, a lot of different subsectors that are within it. And it's a sort of industry of everything, because it applies to all aspects. And for my part, my sort of opening was, I had an initial interest, of course, in the environment. I was a geographer into my maps. And from there, after doing a BSc in geography, I specialized a bit more in doing a master's in pollution monitoring. And that was fantastic. It gave me a grounding in a lot of sort of scientific principles. But one of the key aspects was on waste and waste treatment, which from there led me, and it was a very great opportunity to work with the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, CIWM. And that's where I really got into sort of all elements of waste and the different sectors within that.
Right, got you. What would you said that master's was fascinating? What was it? What really piqued your interest so much in that?
I feel it's the pertinence of just every single thing that we use has its ultimate sort of endpoint and how it's treated. So you almost, in essence, have to, you break down a lot of the aspects of all the items that you use in your day-to-day life. Everything has its sort of, its life and how it's used, but where it ends up is not always the same. There's a sort of lots of options behind it. And part of the work I did was looking at how you can ensure that the material is best used. And there's elements such around how it's controlled through the waste hierarchy, which is essentially just where the waste should be used. And to simplify it is the sort of pyramid where you start off of sort of the best ways to use waste and prevent it, wherever you can reuse it. And then, of course, there's always recycling. But then you get down to the sort of last resorts of recovering energy from it and then finally disposal. And for me, it's that sort of holistic approach. I found there's all number of solutions and combinations. And that's where I sort of, again, it's just quite fascinating really to see the different avenues, and it reflects the different challenges that different countries or industries face as well within that.
So knowing what you know now, how do you view, does it change your kind of your everyday approach to the waste that's, that's in your house, that's in public, that's in your, because it's quite hidden to the process of waste and the dealing with waste is quite hidden to your average person, I suppose. They pop it in the bins at home, they pop it in the skips at work, and it gets taken somewhere, but we don't really have much visibility into the next steps after that. So what have you kind of discovered from your kind of deep dive into it?
I think, no, and it is that. It is a case of you start to sort of wonder, where does this material end up? And some of the sort of really sort of great work, which I've really been fortunate to be part of, is looking at the control systems in place, because I've supported developing policy documents, which there's one at the moment called WM3, which is essentially the sort of doomsday book of all types of waste. It's a sort of 6-digit code for every single thing that might exist, and you work your way through it. And I helped with the sort of the guidance on that. And it really gives you sort of real granular detail that everything has its own different treatment option. But then, of course, where it ends up is the other side, which often it is easily overlooked when you have the solution, because often waste is put into broad packages. It's sort of, you put it into the bin and it goes away, which is a fantastic system, but it's not singular. There's lots of variety within that, and within there's opportunities to improve. And that's where everyone will probably realize at the moment that there's the shift and change, that there's more bins options outside. There's options. A big one at the moment is food waste, and that's becoming mandatory to get the most out of that, because it can be, again, recycled and turned into new products as well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on at the moment. It's a kind of an interesting time for change. When you look back over your career so far, would you say there's been a specific challenge or a turning point that has really kind of influenced or changed how you approach things today?
I think there hasn't really been any one single sort of approach or challenge or singular change. I think because really the sort of winning combination is just sort of openness in terms of working in waste. The general thing, if I had any sort of suggestion, and if anyone's sort of coming into this, is the classic go-to of saying yes to sort of to pick up options and look at different solutions. And with waste, you can become specialized. You can be sort of really sort of look at one particular area. You could look at, say, batteries, say, for example, or other materials. I think the benefit I came from was the fact my background in, say, pollution and, say, chemistry was also an example of examples where there's new issues around, say, forever chemicals. And that comes into the waste orbit of catching that before it enters into the environment. And I did lots of work on PFOA and all these things that at the time seemed like good ideas in terms of manufacturing uses, but now are coming back to roost. So in terms of, say, challenges, I think it's almost a case of just putting yourself out there and challenging not just to yourself, but actually trying to sort of put different options on the table. And that's often what we're doing a lot now in terms of waste, because it's, as you say yourself, it's changing quite rapidly, which is quite a fascinating area, but it's making it work per the case use, which is always very varied.
Yeah, and requires some kind of trial and experimentation, I suppose, to figure that out. Yeah, okay. So I just want to pick up something that you mentioned, or you've intimated to a couple of times before, that you have a view that people should view or could potentially view waste as a potential resource instead of a problem. So could you just explain that a little bit more? Why do you think that's the case, and what do you mean by that?
And it's understandable, because I think my sort of outline before I go in is that I can understand for a lot of us, it's waste often has been, even at best times, a byproduct of what we do. It's essentially when we utilize something, we have packaging which has delivered its end product, but then what do you then do with it? And with this, it's a case of, well, you've designed something, and if I take an example, say polystyrene, fantastic plastic. It's extremely light, low density, low cost. It doesn't cost much to produce. However, you have those same problems when you have the waste disposal side, and that you have to ship vast sums of it in order to get the value back. And again, this is where I sort of feel that it's changing that view to see, okay, well, yes, this output now is a challenge, but now how we can make the most of it. And already there's been cases where technologies in the waste to X sector, which is sort of an evolution of what we might see in terms of waste to end product, where you can take some of these really difficult wastes that conventionally were low value or were difficult to recycle or put to other use, and now can actually be used for new materials or even fuels as well. So I think, yes, it's one of these things where that's why I can emphasize that it at this time, with some of these materials and waste, that it can be a difficult solution, but ultimately they do have a resource aspect, and ultimately, and probably the biggest one, is the value side as well.
Okay, so could you maybe give us an example of that you've come across?
I think. Well, to sort of go a bit deeper into the waste to X side, which is a very catch-all term, and that's very much a rapidly developing field, and it's driven by a combination of two things. So waste is ultimately driven in terms of treatment by value, cost, and then, the gate fees around removing that waste. That's how it sort of generally works. At this time, because of efforts in terms of introducing policies to drive waste down, recycling targets, but also that of, say, carbon targets as well, with carbon capture. And there's one around the corner called ETS, which is the Emission Trading Scheme, which is a cap and trade system. And it's broader coming out, and it's going to affect waste as well. Because of these aspects, it means that conventional waste solutions, which would be, say, high in terms of its carbon impact or other environmental impacts, are no longer as cost effective, which then means some of these more nascent, newer technologies, and one of which under waste to X is something called chemical recycling, which is distinct from conventional normal recycling, which is mechanical. Mechanical recycling, as you might see pictures of, they shred the material, take a plastic, they'll filter it, all those. With chemical recycling, you're essentially breaking it down back to its monomers, so you can make it into new plastics. And I feel that's one of those areas where I've seen recently it's getting a lot of traction, because, as I say, it tackles materials that previously were just not as cost effective to treat under the current systems.
So say a manufacturing site is generating large amounts of, a particular waste, maybe some of these plastics. What options do they have then? If they, what options do they have for getting involved in kind of newer initiatives like this?
it's all about discussion with waste treatment and this other term, waste brokerage, which is essentially the sort of, in very simplistic terms, the trade of these materials and wastes and resources and where they end up. And more, we're seeing now that previously waste services, waste contracting was simply just a case of you'd sign up for an agreed amount of waste to be taken away at a regular interval at a certain cost. Now there's much more greater discussions in terms of harmonizing the new infrastructure that's being developed to make the use of these materials, so that, say, targets around, say, recycled contents can then link up with manufacturers or other industries or other sectors that have this byproduct, so they can intercept that and make the most of that. And we've seen it on broader scales across Europe as well. There are countries where already they're looking at, say, outsourcing materials to essentially import in to increase recyclability as well. So it's it's that sort of waste brokerage side, which is the area where they can.
I see. So it's quite a complex mix, really, of the cost of doing something with these materials, which is going to take, time and energy and, an effort, plus the result of what will be kind of emitted during that process and what will be left over at the end, and whether that's going to meet regulatory targets or not. So in terms of what happens with this information, it's really there's quite a lot of complex factors kind of influence. With this waste material, there's a fair amount of complex kind of factors influencing that decision, I suppose.
Definitely. And I think, and unfortunately, that's sort of the nature of this area. And there's been a lot of efforts to try and reduce that complexity, because, of course, if there's any sense of complexity, it goes back to what I mentioned at the start, is the biggest drawback is inefficiencies. And it slows the ability to reach out and make the most of opportunities for these resources, because there's a lot of options on the table. The only thing is they are trying to implement solutions, especially around, say, digital tracking and other schemes and red tape cutting, which are trying to sort of improve that so that it's not such a hurdle to sort of get involved. But from our perspective as consultancies, that's our purpose, is to come in and really sort of simplify that entire system and say, here are the solutions, here's the cost benefits, and ultimately the value that could be gained from it.
Okay. So what do you, in terms of generating valuable resources from waste, what do you think are the most kind of promising, and you mentioned chemical recycling before, what do you think the most promising route is or opportunity is at the moment or in the near future?
It really, and ultimately is, and I hate to give these answers of the it depends, which is, again, it's the angle from which industry you're coming at it. I think from my perspective, what I've seen, plastics is a big sort of difficult material area in terms of some of its uses, but not for all of it. I think in terms of, say, materials and increased use, I think food waste is one of the ones that's high up there, because, of course, it has high carbon, also water impacts. Same could be said about textiles in that regard as well. What we've also seen as another area, which is also improving rapidly, is looking at waste electronics, or WEEE, which is waste electronic and electronic equipment. And again, there's a lot of opportunity in that market because it has a lot of valuable materials, metals, of course, which are very much seen as the sort of next sort of target area. So I think those are just some of the few, but it's not to neglect all waste types, because we're very fortunate that some areas we've already sort of really tackled and improved upon, and already getting good use from. Paper, cardboard, certain types of glass, all these sorts of things have already made great strides. But it's not to say that it is all part of a broader picture, how we use this and what options are available for day-to-day users to recycle or make the most of materials as well.
So if you're enjoying this episode, please give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That would help us to keep bringing authentic manufacturing conversations with the people who are shaping our industry. Thank you. So tell me about the circular economy then. How do you think, and is that related to the waste to X that we were discussing kind of previously? Yeah, because I've got a vague understanding of the circular economy, but I'd be interested to hear your take on it.
Definitely. And yes, and it's still evolving. The overriding principles and concept is well established, but there's all these sort of branches, like as you say, which ties into Waste2X, which has come along in leaps and bounds, fit into that. And in essence, without, again, and avoiding over complexity, it is closing that circle so that material where it starts out as a resource and is manufactured, transformed, and as a good, and then ultimately then disposed, comes right back around again. And we've seen that the market naturally, and this is not without stimulation so much by there's some policy drivers, the price of goods and everything else going up, is following this market just inherently in its nature, because for the reason I said, there's efficiencies to be gained, resources to be brought back and used, and ultimately in areas that there's some high quality materials to be utilized at the same time, and it's on a global scale. That's the broader picture of it. It's not just in any sort of one particular country that's leading way. It's actually happening worldwide. And what we're seeing as well, that it's really influenced by some of the large players in terms of where they're trying to make the most of this material. It only furthers and encourages others to do the same. So I'd say that's probably one of the biggest shifts I've seen, is that it's just this wide sort of universal adoption, maybe with their own sort of different emphasis, but ultimately it's just sort of picking up pace at this time.
So you think that's an interesting development over the next few years then to see, hopefully that will expand. Okay, great. Thank you. So I would like to change things up slightly here and go for some quick fire questions where we say if it's a myth or a truth. Well, you say if it's I'll say it. You're the expert, so you tell me what you think. So, myth or truth? Recycling is the only way to deal with waste.
That is a definite myth, and it's without going again to sort of the different areas and solutions. What I mentioned at the very start was this thing called the waste hierarchy. And directly above that system, at the very top, is something called waste prevention. And underneath that's reuse, which is much more conventional. That's where you can take, an old piece of furniture and give it life in another home. And then under that, you're recycling. The really exciting one that's around the corner is this quite sort of nascent concept, is waste prevention, which in a perfect world, the waste never exists. And it's up to there's a lot of people, a lot smarter people than me, trying to work out ways to track that, to monitor that, and give it a value. Because conventionally, recycling is the go-to target, because you can say,
yes, yeah,
as a figure.
So what would be an example of waste prevention then?
So waste prevention would be, for example, you take, again, just to take furniture, it could be that it's created and you've built a new office block. You know how much that material is going to need, how many sort of seating or whatever range it might be. X amount of chairs are going to be there. An ideal thing, that the end of life of that office turmoil might be 10 years, but you already know that you're just going to transit that building across and all the material just to another area within that. So then its purpose and everything else continues exactly the same. Ownership might change within that time, but nothing happens. There's nothing leaving that system. So that's sort of the ideal in that situation.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting concept. The waste hierarchy with the prevention at the top and other steps down the bottom. That's an interesting concept as well. Customers are starting to care more about how their businesses handle waste. Do you think that's a myth or that's a truth?
They are definitely truth. Considering much more about how the waste is handled, because ultimately it comes back to them in terms of some of the tools that are in place, such as extended producer responsibility for what they produce, and that includes not just the goods but also elements around the packaging that go with it. So no, they are very much looking at that because it's ultimately within their interest as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Sustainability is just a buzzword and it doesn't really help businesses.
I'm biased, but I think that's pretty sure that's a myth, and I can understand. And this is the thing which I can't emphasize, because where we come at it, and myself and say the consulting side, we have to understand what the challenges of who the user is. And I can understand that, say, elements around sustainability and, as we mentioned, some complexities, not always the case, might pose some sort of not as much benefits as might be perceived. Ultimately, as I say, it has a lot of benefits, and ultimately you can grow within that system as well. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a myth.
Okay, fair enough. That was a bit of a more extreme controversial one that we threw out there. But I'm interested on your belief on your thoughts on this one. Switching, and this is thinking about more in businesses and organizations, switching to better waste management practices always disrupts operations.
Ooh, I think, well, there you go. This is a fair one. So I feel, I'd argue, and I'm going to explain it without going too long in too much depth. I'll probably say truth, but with a caveat there, in that, yes, there is disruption, but that's the purpose, and it can be a positive disruption in that you're modifying systems to be improved. If you have a waste system in place and you don't disrupt it, you're essentially not changing it.
Sure. Yes. I guess the
Mm.
I guess the inference in that one, which maybe wasn't totally clear, was disrupt operations in a negative way. So make operations like less efficient, I suppose. Maybe because of the additional steps from the waste management. I suppose that's the inference in that question.
No, and that's completely fair. And I think in that case, it's, yeah, I'd say there's a less of a disruption element and more ultimately just essentially a improvement in efficiencies and systems, which is how all industry works over time. We look at ways that things have become more automated, the recent use of AI, better for worse, and how these things evolve naturally. And this is simply part of that. And what we're determined to use and what we're trying to do as a sort of broad sector is to turn that around so that it's ultimately to get the most of that, which serves all these purposes that I've mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Every factory creates waste, some kind of waste that can't be reused.
Oh, that's a myth. No, that's definitely a myth there, because I've seen it in lots of different sectors where and I think this is the other side of the coin where all sectors of manufacturers aren't unfortunately created equal in terms of the challenges they may face due to the materials that they may use. Historically speaking, batteries now, it's a really big area, especially cars and everything else. Go back a few decades, your car battery, which is a lead acid battery, historically speaking, was the most recycled metal lead in the world because it was a contained system. It was a hazardous material, so it was very well monitored and controlled. So it had that head start, and metals and glass and other sectors have the ability to get around some of these challenges a bit more. So yeah, so unfortunately, I think some face greater challenges than others.
How about this? Only big companies can make a difference in reducing waste.
Absolute myth. Yeah. So, and again, it's often a grassroots approach. I've had colleagues around the world and lots of different countries where we supported growth where they don't have the resources for large schemes, and it's schemes that could be rolled out using mobile phones and collections and all sorts of things that could be done on a very small micro action scale, really, but they add up as well, which is the amazing thing around it.
Whose responsibility is it, do you think, to lead initiatives like that? And, what's the best way to get initiatives like that, rolled out?
With that, I'm afraid it's on everyone's shoulders, which is, unfortunately, I think we could just point to one person, that's the champion. And there's a few of us as well out there who are very much pushing for it as well. But ultimately, it's down to all of us and everything. And it's not necessarily, again, I can't emphasize, it shouldn't be perceived as, say, a challenge or, any form of disruption. It's allowing opportunity to be there as well. But again, it's completely specific to that person and where they are. So a person on my side, we can talk to policymakers, we can inform in terms of treatment and options that are out there. But even just day-to-day public users, once there's sources that they can use, they can research to say, I have these batteries, where can I take them to? Or right at the top, I've got a car manufacturer and I have these byproducts. Who can I talk to get the value back? It applies to everyone in that circle.
Okay, so you've nicely led on to a follow-up question there. So, a manufacturing company, maybe a small to medium-sized manufacturing company, say they want to take some small steps today to, potentially changing their waste management, with the view of making of it being more, better handled, more valuable in the future. Where should they start?
I think the classic go-to industries we say do a waste audit. It's essentially breaking it down, looking at what you have and working from there. Because in that way, you can tackle what material you have now, where it can go and how you can make the most of it. But ultimately, then after that, you go, okay, well, we've discovered there are these sort of certain products or resources that we need to get, to utilize, or how we can minimize in this case. And that's when you can start looking at, say, changing systems up to, include new materials or recycled content options. So I think understanding what you have is best place to start with that. Yeah.
Of businesses who do that and, look at where it can go and what better ways, what benefits do you think they see, that come out of doing a process like that?
I think it's the vision and clarity you can get once you understand what said action creates that waste. And you can make a direct connection to understand that if I produce or do X amount of something, this is what's going to be the end result. And then they start looking at the chain of where it keeps being added to. So I feel understanding that and having that picture, it just allows you to then start to consider your options in terms of what you can do with it. Because again, there's no one catch-all solution when it comes to waste. There's no sort of a factory you send everything to and it all gets separated out. Although I should say they have made efforts in that. There's lots of clever robotic sorting, clever things that could be done. But ultimately, it's what you can do at the start where it's being generated, which you get the most benefit back ultimately.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to that's not exactly what you meant by it, but I guess it's similar to your waste hierarchy that you mentioned earlier. And, the higher or the earlier on you catch things and decide what to do with it, it's easier than waiting till the end and having to sort it out from all sorts of different materials. And, it's a more challenging, it's more of a challenge at that point than earlier on, I guess. Okay. Couple of wrap-up questions then. If you could make one major change in how businesses approach waste today, what would it be?
I think if there's one direct change, I think, and it ties into what we've been sort of talking about it before, I think it's a bit around the mindset in terms of what could be done with the waste. And there's two parts to this. There's, of course, the sort of change in the mindset of, as say, the opening, which is waste being considered a resource, but also the other side is waste into almost any form of resource. There's multiple options in terms of, I have this material and at this point we get energy from it. You can incinerate it. Well, that's great, but you can also take the step before that and think, well, actually you can form new products from this material. So I think having that sort of different mindset then just allows a lot more opportunities for not just your own business, but neighboring areas who might partner to utilize that as well. So I think that's where it opens it up.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You need that overview to see the bigger picture that, yes, it may not, what's a problem for you may be helpful for someone. Yeah. For someone else. Yeah. Okay. What's your vision for the future of waste?
I think my vision, and it broadly is the same as sort of the alignment, which is where the industry is going in terms of, I'd say, the rollout of circular economy and these principles around it. I think for me, it's to get the most out of all the resources in the market, but at the same time, limiting, as I say, the cost, the infrastructure, the time or disruption that it may cause to all different elements, in that it could be shared across the sector so that efforts could be made by the start, say public users can say separate materials. At the same time, manufacturers should take the share of making materials more readily recyclable or separable. And then in terms of, say, the treatment side, giving as many options for that waste to be used. So it's, as I say, it's on everyone's shoulders to try and sort of tackle this. But my vision is that it's somewhat more equally shared. So there's less of a burden. As you say, you don't want the problem just to essentially end at that last point. If it could be spread out, it just makes, it's sort of this transition much more smoother, but also just allows more benefits to be equally incorporated.
And how do you think that's best done to spread that out? Does that mean, targets for different groups, or how does that get spread out?
Primarily targets. So policies have an almost direct impact, and historically governments tend not to, for the most part, although sometimes it might seem contrary, like to add targets in. They like the industry and the sector to essentially sort of resolve these things and sort of find its own course. Policies are then a stopgap to force significant change. But at the same time, and with the way the market's evolving in terms of just simply goods and commerce, value is just inherently increasing, which is therefore just, again, on that same route, inherently allowing more opportunities for this waste to occur naturally. So I feel both a push by policies will support and help guide that, but also just simply making the most of these materials is also the way that this is going to happen best, because again, it's best to bring people on board than to push them into it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, definitely. A carrot rather than the stick.
Yes,
yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming on the show today, Greg. Really appreciated that chat. What's the best way for people to find out a bit more about you and what you're working on at the moment?
Well, please reach out to my platform. So I'm on LinkedIn. Please, at any point, reach out to me. And I'll also say I'm on my company's profile at Ricardo. But either or, you can catch me there.
Great. Thank you. Well, thanks a lot for your time today. Hope you have a great day. Take care, Greg.
Thank you. Take care.
So thanks to Greg for a great episode today. Kind of interesting view on the potential future of waste management within manufacturing, but also just generally across the globe. So if you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, or give us a follow if you're on Apple or Spotify. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.